Okay, well, welcome to this talk on Hokusai's influence on contemporary Japanese culture. My name is Dr. Craig Norris, and in this talk, what I want to explore is this image here, Hokusai's famous Great Wave. It's probably his most well-known piece, and it's one that's endured throughout time. But there's another aspect of Hokusai's work which has really endured, and it's from these collected volumes, which are often referred to as the Hokusai manga. Now, we all know manga today in the 20th, 21st century as disposable, collectible comic books from Japan, but it's a really interesting moment in time to explore the debates around manga's cultural heritage and the role of traditional Japanese artists such as Hokusai. So I want to explore and dive a little deeper into the influence and politics behind this 19th century form of manga and where we can learn from that to appreciate today's manga. So as you can see from this opened volume, there's three types of color which is used in most manga: a black, gray, or pale flesh color. And for Hokusai's manga work, it was mainly published between 1814 to 1878 in 15 stitched bound volumes. And these volumes in entirety consist of about 4,000 images. And as you can see, they've kind of snapshots of life. They have various purposes, though. Some of them are instructional. Some of them were about learning the trade of creating manga. They certainly enjoyed great popularity and continued to be published almost 3 decades after Hokusai's death. Now, this relevancy of Hokusai still continues till today. Here we have a recent adaptation of a quite well-known recent manga by Sugiura, and it's a series of comics that he wrote called Miss Hokusai. This is the animated version directed by Hara Keiichi from Production IG back in 2015. And the most interesting thing, if you've not seen this film, is it tells the story of Hokusai and his relationship with his daughter. But in particular, what I want to do is contextualize later, not yet, but foreshadowing later, a really interesting episode of a kind of spirit with a long neck, that appears. It's a really interesting adaptation of that Hokusai imagery, and certainly one which I think provides further thought. So where else can we see Hokusai's influence? Well, passports. So passports recently in Japan now have started to feature images from Hokusai's work, and these of course are from the famous 36 Views of Mount Fuji ukiyo-e series. From 2016 on, most passports have featured those. Also, unusual ways it's popped up. Here's one taken from Twitter promoting local prefecture, which was where Hokusai was born in the mid-1700s, kind of claiming ownership of him through their number plates for cars. Again, you can debate the cultural heritage of that, but it does, I guess, raise one really interesting question. Why does Hokusai endure? And I think there are 3 key categories that we can unpack Hokusai's endurance within. One is a sense of plundering Hokusai, a kind of exploiting, commodifying of Hokusai. Another one is a kind of depicting of Hokusai. Hokusai himself, the artist, as something to depict, something to reference, someone to reference, a kind of a symbol, a figure that stands for an older time of history. Which brings us to our third category, which is historicizing Hokusai as the origin of today's manga culture. But let's look firstly at this first category of plundering hawkseye. I must admit it was an enjoyable exercise just to trawl through various internet domains looking for where hawkseyes work is used today. And interestingly, again, there's a convergence of high culture and low culture within hawkseyes work. Here we have what I guess could be considered high culture. I mean, it's certainly expensive. Some might say a little gauche, a little tacky. But here we have a very expensive, finely crafted watch, again, representing and referencing the Great Wave. And in fact, you can pretty much deep dive, excuse the pun, into the Great Wave as a key intertextual reference for Hokusai. One of my favorites, in fact, is this series of images from the Fuji toilet line, which has decorated their toilets with Hokusai imagery. Of course, here we have the Great Wave. Here we have other views from the 36 Views of Mount Fuji series. Again, volcanic. I'm sure you can think of references that the appropriateness of that might be making. But let's leave toilets behind. Excuse the pun. And we can see, again, these kind of convergences of popular culture happening here. We have the wave transformed into Godzilla with the katakana for Godzilla, Gojira, on the side. This image has also been taken up for shoe design. So again, referencing this kind of 6 degrees of separation from Hokusai's wave as we move towards a kind of meme of Godzilla, then to Converse shoes, and inevitably t-shirts. Of course, also there's seasonal drinks and food. Food is a central thing in which I think the recirculation of Hokusai's work continues. Obviously, cup noodles. Also, material itself being used to replicate Hokusai. Here we have one painted from red wine. Oreo biscuits, Cookie Monster. And again, these are plumbing the depths of Reddit and various other online communities, which again have taken up the Hokusai image as a kind of meme generator. This one's quite interesting because it's designed for the visually impaired so that they can feel the wave much like a braille surface. Let's look at the second category now of depicting Hokusai and why that might be interesting to explore. Of course, as I mentioned before, there's the adaptation of the manga series looking at Miss Hokusai. But what's interesting, this is the anime version, is the kind of references it's drawing upon in the representation of his life, the kind of broad mythologizing of stories associated with him. And the one I really want to discuss is Sugiura Hinako's Sarusiberi, which consists of 30 episodic chapters that provide atmospheric insights into various aspects of Hokusai's life. It's characterized by some restraint in regards to the use of manga-esque dramatizations, only rarely employing speed lines, pictograms, sound words, and close-ups. And you could say maybe that evokes a respectful distance. The past can be observed, but maybe not easily consumed. So again, what's really interesting within this is the chapter 20, which I want to go into a little bit further, the wandering soul disease, where Hokusai and his friend Hachizo visit the licensed red light district of the Yoshiwara in order to verify rumors about the high-class courtesan Sayogoromo. She grants them permission to spend the night in her side room until they hear a small bell, and indeed they witness her neck stretching and wandering around, held back eventually only by the mosquito net. When Hokusai points to the possibility that her head might not return one day, she exhibits indifference. Thus, the whole point of the episode turns out to be the spectacle itself, which affirms that hot summer days are the time of the supernatural beings and ghostly apparitions. While other chapters in this series highlight the magical power of pictures themselves, this one exhibits Sugiura's aptitude for visual storytelling through a motif widely shared in late Edo period, which the Hokusai manga also displays. So here's the image here of various ensemble of these creatures from this series, and highlighting the magical power of the pictures themselves. This one exhibits Sugiura's aptitude for visual storytelling through a motif widely shared in the late Edo period, which the Hokusai manga also displays. In the following scenes, we can also see the adaptation of this famous Hokusai in the manga version. So that's the original one from Hokusai's manga. And here what I'll show next are the more modern manga version of it, right? As he's gone into the courtesan's chamber to witness her transformation, as we see here, as she departs through her neck into this spirit form, or ghostly form. So, Hokusai as the origin of today's manga culture, how does that hold up? So again, if we return to these Hokusai manga books, we can see that, again, they seem to have some similarities around the depiction of everyday settings. And again, if we translate manga, it's often translated man, diverse, random, rambling, capricious, and ga, line drawing, picture rendered with brush and ink. Importantly, Hokusai did not coin the word manga. In the late Edo period, manga signified a large quantity of subject matter and styles. It could include catalogues, reference books, and other things. In the late Edo period, late 18th to early 19th century, manga signified a large quantity of subject matter and styles. And in the Meiji period, manga began to signify a certain quality of work, that it was comical and satirical drawings. So in modern Japanese, manga could be seen here as referring to cartoons and caricatures, newspaper and comic strips, the yonkoma manga, story manga, graphic narratives, magazine series, gekiga, that's picture dramas, dramatic comics, and a general term for graphic narratives. Loanword, the English loanword comic, also appears, and it can be often referred to for books, the tankobon editions, often as komitsu, or as graphic narratives, the graphic novel, which attained popularity in the US and Europe as a form of redefining comics as something that's not just for children, they're graphic novels. And this term itself exists as a loanword within Japan. So why does Hokusai endure? And again, various scholars have pointed out three main reasons why Hokusai has endured today. Firstly, it elevates contemporary pop culture. Secondly, it's an entry point into old Japanese art. And thirdly, it serves a function as part of the 20th, 21st century commodity culture today. So let's dive into each one of these more deeply. And we can really see that through a number of really significant exhibitions which have happened recently. Here's one, Manga Hokusai Manga, sponsored by the Japan Foundation and directed by Jacqueline Burnt. And a lot of the work I'm drawing upon is from Jacqueline Burnt in today's talk. She's really a central figure in contextualizing the historic and contemporary role manga plays today, both in Japan as well as around the world. The reading that we explored, drawing, reading, sharing, is the pamphlet linked to that exhibition. And I want to take us through that pamphlet in a little bit more depth now to discuss some of the things Professor Burnt was drawing upon around Hokusai's role with manga. So firstly, genre. We can really see the foreshadowing, I guess, of manga's role as a humorous form of comic entertainment. If we look at examples of humor in Hokusai's work, quite a good example is this one, which is from a later volume, volume 11. And what's interesting about this, it's a figure, of course, this is the opening page. It's a figure standing on the head or bump of an old hermit or artist. And what's interesting about this piece is the amusement of the objects that are collected next to the old guy. It's interesting because, of course, this is volume 11. So initially the project that Hokusai was working on was comprised of just 10 volumes. But in time, the Hokusai manga did continue, and additional volumes were added due specifically by popular demand. Therefore, what we're looking at here is the opening page, the front piece, to volume 11, which accompanied the title of part 1 of the exhibition that Professor Burnt opened. So it features a Chinese boy adding the character of New to the manga. And the boy standing on top of the god of longevity, who seems to be apologizing to the prospective buyers for making them wait. He does this by means of a subtle pun, relying on the reader's recognition of the utensils placed in the lower left corner. An ink stick, pronounced sumi, on top, then a scroll, makimono, in the middle, and a fan, sensu, at the bottom. Combine them together, of course, and you have the phrase sumimasen, or sorry. So here we have them highlighted here. So again, at the top we have the ink stick, sumi, the scroll, makimono, and the fan, sensu. All right, so sumimasen. So again, a kind of form of humor driving that discussion. Another location of humor, of course, here, the ruling class, the samurai becoming a figure for fun, very rarely done, but here we have an example of one with the samurai answering nature's call while guarded by his meek retainers covering their noses because of this stench. Now, another influence from manga that's interesting to consider is pictorial storytelling. When manga attained popularity around the West, much was made of the particularities of the manga literacy, or the literacy required to unpack these images. So we can see there that red line is drawing a kind of eyesight trace of how one's eye follows these images, quite different from a grid type layout. Now we can see some pictorial layout going on here, the vertical and horizontal storytelling. There is a kind of continuity happening between each of these panels, both across a vertical and horizontal storytelling style, but it's not using the type of speed balloons or speed lines which are more familiar to today. And again, these are quite rare uses. I mean, here we have another one where there's a story being told here, a type of narrative story just through the pictures alone of a jousting exercise, which does indeed stretch over 10 pages. And, again, we can see a type of storytelling going on here, but overall the Hokusai manga privileges spatial lineups, listings of different places in Edo, which might be interesting to view, rather than specific narrative stories. So here we have the story continuing of the jousting tournament. What's interesting with that type of spatial design is how it's been used in manga explanation guides. So this is an example from 1950 that's explaining, again, how one's eye gravitates around a page. So again, that idea of illiteracy that at some point is learnt and then normalized. If we consider the role of speech bubbles, of course, in contemporary manga, speech bubbles are everywhere, as they are in any comic or graphic novel. If we try to find traces of speed bubbles within Hokusai's work, scholars have pointed to some examples, such as this one. It relates the legendary dream of Kantan, also known as the world inside a pillow. The story goes when resting in the Chinese village of Handan, an ordinary man sees himself reigning in the country for 50 prosperous years while taking a short nap. It's retold in a no drama based on this story. And, we can see an amusing reference to this here in this image. What I'm drawing your attention to, though, is that dream having a tail kind of connected to the guy's head. It is trying to have almost a type of speech bubble or a bubble appearing to contain a narrative within it. Though it's slightly different. Here's the whole image, again, of that dream sequence to consider. Here's one that's, again, trying to gesture towards what would later maybe be considered speech bubbles. It's an interesting image that's portraying the kind of production of a book that we see occurring here. What's interesting here about this book production and the double spread that we're seeing is that it shows the folding and collating of the printed pages into unbound booklets. The man in the middle stirring the kind of heat source is the publisher. According to the text across the top, he has administered a special potion to all his staff to make them work faster. Under the influence, the worker on the right side starts to hear cymbals struck by this kind of gong sound, as one of the potion's ingredients was charred by cymbal the inaudible sound is indicated by a balloon, which purely pictorial content. So here we see that's the this guy's taken that syrup from his boss, and he's hearing that sound, that gonging sound, just to his ear to help him drive him harder to work. The dialogue in the monologue, however, remains unframed, much as we could consider. And there's the second guy as well, kind of a speech bubble there, or at least a narrative contextualization. So let's move on now to the idea of speed lines and whether or not we can trace any continuities around speed lines. Here we have, of course, a typical example of these from Dragon Ball Z. And here we have, in a Hokusai piece, a type of speed line. While speed lines aren't used often, in this case, I think we can see water and air movement is coded in that sense of speed. This is again from the Hokusai manga, the Maelstrom of Awa, and it does connote a spring due to literary tradition, which is brought into play by the page title itself. So yeah, a kind of speed line possibly. Here we have one that probably is a more stronger connection with the speed line. It's an illustration to storybooks that appeared here, and it's an illustration by Hokusai, which is expressing the explosive release of the 108 evil spirits from beneath the ancient kind of steel that's rendered in these black lines. Another collaboration between Bakken and Hokusai. Here we have Crescent Moon, the adventure of Tamitomo, and it employs in one of its illustrations light streaks to suggest the spiritual power of the centrally placed sorcerer monk, at whom the medieval hero Tamitomo, we can see in the upper left-hand corner there, aims his bow. Again, innovative pictorializations by Hokusai adorn even religious storybooks. The life of Shakyamuni, which we see here in the 4th and the 6th volumes. The historical Buddha is shown emanating a radiance strong enough to chastise Satan's lance-bearing army, or the evil spirit's lance-bearing army. What I want to turn now to, rather than the textual analysis, or is to move away from the textual analysis and think more about the kind of apprenticeship culture that Hokusai's work was also located in. Today, many theorists would refer to this as a participatory culture. That's a sharing, a maker culture, and the boom in manga manuals. So it's an industry in itself that creative spaces like manga has fostered, where, from school onwards, as a hobby or as a pathway to professionalization, people buy manuals to learn how to draw these manga further. Interestingly, this type of sharing of techniques was central to Hokusai's manga volumes. Hokusai's manga volumes themselves also contained explanations of art styles. This is an interesting example from Volume 3, which is showing Western Central perspective. What's interesting here is the use of parts of the sky, and the third for the ground, the other one on vanishing lines, although not converging at the same point. So again, that idea of perspective, very different from traditional kind of super flat ukiyo-e type designs. Continuing this idea of manga as a manual, how to draw book, is these type of pictorial indexes, which would be shared among hobbyists and followers of this manga. Hokusai's compilation recalls the how to draw manga manuals that we just saw in this slide before. And again, they've been a noticeable part of manga culture in Japan since the 1950s. And the so-called global manga scene has also developed from the 2000s onwards with these type of learning books. In comparison to the other kinds of comics, contemporary manga has come to be more recognized as quite an innovative form, and again, maybe shares some similarities to Hokusai's work here, including the famous kind of finger wrestling that we see in the left-hand page. And again, it's kind of similar to the manga tutorials in the published books, which represent hands and show people how to draw hands. So here's an example of a manga guidebook that again is just depicting various positions of hands to instruct aspiring manga artists on how to effectively draw hands. So again, we can see some similarities there to the Hokusai work. Is another example again of how to draw manga. One from Tezuka. And returning to Hokusai, again we can see this type of manga manual form occurring from the grimaced face that we're seeing here. And facial expressions, of course, play a significant role in a lot of manga. Here we have some examples here of facial expressions across some very, very popular how to draw manga examples. So again, we can see some fascinating similarities between Hokusai's work from the 19th century till today. Again, through this we can see the influence of Hokusai's manga not simply being from artists learning how to draw manga, but also academically, that through referencing back to Hokusai's work, it does elevate manga's role itself. So hopefully through this survey of Hokusai's influence and the way in which it's contextualized, it provides some interesting connections to the past that we can reflect on today's manga with. Thank you very much for listening.